Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of the healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Daniel Coole, Managing Director at Surgical Holdings in the United Kingdom. Daniel has over 20 years in the surgical instrument manufacturing industry and is the chair of the Surgical Instruments Special Interest Section for the Association of British Healthcare Industries. Hank, I'm definitely a big surgical instrument guy, especially manufacturing, also the different coatings. We're going to talk about that and more, and especially Daniel's experience that's really coming from a family lineage as a fourth generation surgical instrument maker.
Daniel's one of those folks, if you're on LinkedIn and tapped into the sterile processing discussion across the globe, he's a known quantity there. It's a very creative mind and perspective on what's going on in the industry, on the UK side especially. So that's why we wanted to have him on the show so early on and get that conversation going across the pond.
So just a reminder before we get into the first segment with Daniel, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info. Facebook is facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast. And finally, the LinkedIn page, linkedin.com/company/Beyond Clean. If you have feedback for the show, if you're interested in being a guest on a future show or just any general questions, you can send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with our guest. Joining us now, Daniel Coole, Managing Director at Surgical Holdings in the United Kingdom. Daniel, really excited to have you on the show. You'll be our first guest from outside the continental U.S., and so I think Hank and I are both really excited to talk to you about a little bit of the differences, overseas and some of the things that are positive coming out of the U.K. as well.
Hi to you both, and thank you for the opportunity to say to yourself, Justin, and to Hank. I think Hank and I we've been in the same sort of LinkedIn circles for a while, and Hank is a bit of a royalty, I guess, from a decontamination LinkedIn perspective. So I'm looking forward to engaging and getting some finding out what the differences are, stateside to the UK.
Well, I know some of the things we'll get into is just the difference in nomenclature, terminology, and I know Hank and I talked about this before we came on, but obviously there's different acronyms, and we'll get into some of that. But I think first, give the audience a little introduction to your career, because I think it's pretty interesting to see on your LinkedIn profile, you're a fourth generation surgical instrument maker. Talk a little bit about, I guess, the family business and how you came into that. I'm also wondering if you ever thought about doing anything else, or if you always knew that this would be your profession.
Well, I'd love to say I think when I was a child I was dreaming of becoming a surgical instrument maker, but that's probably not entirely true. However, I think obviously it's something that manufacturing surgical instruments is something that's been in our family for a long time. My father, of course, was a surgical instrument maker, initially training in manufacture of micro instruments. His father and uncle before him, all working out of a company called McCarthy Medical in the UK, which was a trade manufacturer, if you like. It seemed like it was perhaps a bit of destiny that I'd end up also as involved in the industry in some shape or form. So I think at 16, which is the sort of age we were leaving school at that time in the UK, I started doing a few days in the factory, which the business had probably been, the business my father started after leaving McCarthy Medical had been going for around about, 5-6 years. I just I started to get involved and then started an apprenticeship, which really I think we're going to discuss a bit about apprenticeships later on, but it's the thing I think in our industry that you really have to pass on the skills from the previous generations. These technical, I describe as a craft industry, the surgical instrument manufacturing side of things. So I trained for a sort of period of 5 years before I went and did a degree whilst I was also working at Surgical Holdings. Now I'm 38. I've been involved in the business for over 20 years in one shape or form, and I think it's such an interesting line of work. I wouldn't profess to probably being the most technical and skilled surgical instrument maker there ever was, but it certainly gave me a good basis and grounding for going into the rest of the business.
So Daniel, let's drill down a little bit on your background and even on the historical background of your company. Since you've been in the business now for all these generations, you've seen especially a lot of the regulatory changes through the years there in the UK as it has to do with surgical instruments. Can you walk us through some of the big changes over the past 5-10 years that are impacting how you do your job today?
As we all know, I think it seems like perhaps it's something that should have been caught up with a few years ago, but regulation's huge in our industry now. As a surgical instrument maker, we also manufacture orthopedic implants, so a higher class of product. But, it's given us perspective on what is to come in regulation. And I think starting off, obviously, back in the 90s, you had CE marking, which was the first real, eye-opener for the surgical instrument industry. And it was around the time that I think the game was changing, really. We'd gone from, sort of 70s, 80s, where everything was manufactured in the UK using UK Sheffield steel. And then things had started to change. The people were starting to import instruments and forgings from further afield in Asia. And then coupled with that, you had the introduction of CE marking and the changes of regulation. And finally, there was something actually that as Class 1 manufacturers that we were duty bound to have a technical file for our product, to have, some form of decontamination instructions. Eventually that ended up, being a validated, an industry-wide validation for a decontamination instructions. But since then, what's changed? Probably not a lot really until now we're looking at the MDR release from the previous medical, the MDR being the medical device regulation rather than the medical device directive. And I think there's been, as we know, a few examples with the metal on metal hips and also, the PIP breast implant scandal, where it's really just everybody's realised it's time to become accountable. And although we're Class 1 surgical instruments at the moment, I think that filters down to everything. I don't know if you feel the same, and if the same sort of thing is happening in the States.
So you bring up a great point about manufacturers now, at least through regulation, being forced to consider how are the end users, maybe not the surgeons, but the users in the sterile processing, in the CSSD departments, how are they going to clean these devices? Are they cleanable? We've talked a couple of times now about the study that came out about a year ago now talking about robotic instrumentation, and a quote from the article was, they're virtually impossible to clean. Well, so our questions from industry insiders are, well, how can you manufacture something in good faith that's virtually impossible to clean? And so when you're talking about those changes here in the U.S., one of the big considerations from inside facilities is, can we work together with the manufacturers, with these regulatory bodies, to develop some kind of standardization on different modalities of decontamination? As you stated in your answer, can we work together to ensure everything's coming with clear and understandable instructions for processing? At one point, we'll have to do a show that talks about how to translate a technical manual that's written by an engineer into understandable English for someone in that unit to effect what's supposed to be done, not in laboratory settings, but on the front line. So that's been a lot of our focus here for sure. A question that you brought up that I wanted you to speak a little bit about is, who has oversight in these matters in the UK? Is this coming directly from the Department of Health? Are you looking to other third-party groups out here who are coming in to manufacturers and validating their processes? What does that look like?
Well, at the moment, as things stand, Class 1 instruments is to put a CE mark on. It's a self-regulation in respect that we register with our overarching MHRA. They are the regulatory arm, if you like, that then would employ the notified bodies such as your BSIs, SGSs, who would come out and obviously potentially inspect if it was a higher class of product. But where we are with surgical instruments is really, you register and then it's in good faith that you have the correct information in place. You do the correct risk assessments. You have the correct technical information. You have patterns, and that you're accountable. And the interesting thing, the medical device regulation, which is the upgrade to the medical device directive in Europe, is now actually there is a bit of a focus on class 1. There's a slight up classification, and interestingly, that is around the decontamination side of things, which I think is something that is a good thing for industry. But it's not a good thing for industry in respect that we're going to be paying more money because there'll be notified body involvement for the first time. So we'll have to, register with a notified body and get them to approve what we're doing and what we recommend for our instruments. But I think for certain instruments, we'll have to go a step further in our current validation and possibly things such as proving, how many times something can be used and how can we prove it's still safe, because I think, we see hospitals all the time that have instrumentation that's sort of 30, 40 years old, that stuff that that some of the older generations of the Coole family possibly might have made, and believe it or not, it's still working. But, it's that long ago that you sort of, there's not necessarily the technical information there to support those products. So I think moving forward, we all know what needs to be done. And I think there's the danger for me in a lot of these things is that you lose sight of the patient. And I think there's you raised the point about looking at the instruction manual and trying to decode it and trying to put how do you relay that to your technicians in your CSSD departments. Everyone's got to bear in mind that ultimately this has got to be doable for patients to be safe and to get clean instrumentation.
Daniel, the UK has standard cycles for approval of medical devices, which I would think makes it not only a lot easier for the technicians that have to reprocess the equipment, but also from the manufacturer's side, getting approval for those devices. This has to streamline the process. Can you talk a little bit about that versus the US, where somebody can get FDA approval with a wide variety, I guess, or wide variance in cycle times, dry time, etc., versus the standardization that we see in the UK?
So do you mean, obviously in the UK where we have, relatively rigid parameters for, the washer disinfectors run at and the sterilisers. So is that what you mean?
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, as you know, it's pretty standardised. So in the States, it's varied. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, so that's even more of a challenge. So I think in that respect we probably go about our business, and you assume that everybody's going to be sterilising at 134 to 137 degrees, and there's no real need for clarification. I mean, as through the Association for British Healthcare Industries, the ABHI that I'm involved in, we actually, as an industry, undertook our validation for reprocessing, as an industry, because we knew that that there was going to be this standardised approach, and obviously that the HTM recommends that. So I suppose when you're looking at designing an instrument, it does make it a bit easier if all you've got to consider are these cycles. However, I think the game's changing a little bit with regard to with the new HTM, with regard to focus around protein testing instruments. The UK is quite a unique case because we had the CJD issue, and we're still obviously trying to safeguard patients and the public around that. And that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge of not actually having the regulation there which says you've got to do X, Y, Z, and then sort of retrospectively working out how you can then risk assess the devices. And but I think if you think about obviously the hospitals in the UK, sort of 130 plus NHS trusts plus private hospitals, you can't. The money isn't there, and the NHS. I don't know how much you know about it in the States. Obviously, the NHS is strapped for cash. There's not the money to just replace certain instruments because they don't necessarily clean particularly well in some cases. So I think we like a sort of joined up approach with our sterilisation association, that's the Institute for Decontamination Sciences, to try and work with them and think of some common sense stuff that we can implement to keep patients immediately safe. Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. As we wrap up this first segment, I do want to get into something, kind of a quick fun topic, which is the differences in terminology. And I'm only just getting exposed to this because of the conversation that the three of us had before we started recording. But the difference between the United States talking about operating rooms, but in the UK you would term them as theaters. So there are a couple of other interesting differences in terminology like that.
Yeah, I suppose I would. So, as you say, theatres for us is our RR, and I'm sure we've had new starters at our place where we've been liberally discussing theatres, and those guys probably think we're talking about the musical theatres. So you do. I think once you're immersed in the medical industry, it's particularly our industry, you go along with all these acronyms. Say CSSD. Generally, for me, it would be the Sterile Services Department. I think that's probably quite similar for you guys. It's those sort of things are standardised. I mean, we have, obviously, I mentioned our association, referred to as the IDSC. Well, if people hear of that online or see LinkedIn groups about that, that's the Institute of Decontamination Sciences that that have taken major steps forward to promote the decontamination industry in the UK and professionalise it and get it recognised from a scientific perspective. So, acronym-wise, I think I haven't really got much more any other particularly interesting ones to throw at you there, unless you have some that I could see the reverse of.
I wanted to jump in there on that decontamination one in particular, Daniel. There's a lot of power in how we describe certain things and certain aspects of an industry, and I think decontamination, possibly more than the common American sterile processing services, central sterile department, when you pinpoint on decontamination and use that as the placeholder to describe everything that happens in the reprocessing life cycle of that device, what you're saying in that is so important for us on the inside to understand, but just like we're talking about with the manufacturer's perspective, it starts with decontamination. That's where it starts. We're going to have some folks on later episodes, talking about some of the newer technologies in sterilization and high-level disinfection, but you can't get there. You can't even get there no matter how good those technologies are if you lose it on the decontamination side. So I thought that and how that is used to describe the same job but with a different emphasis perhaps on what's going on, I thought that was terrific.
Yeah, it is. I say it's an industry that's changing. It has sort of changed over the years, and obviously in the UK you're now it's fallen under the sort of the science banner in any hospitals. I might be speaking out of turn in some instances, but certainly it has the potential to obviously be attracting the microbiologists of this world into it directly, to really because of the science aspect and that recognition, if you like. But I think it's the two terminologies, decontamination and sterile services, are sort of used flippantly, but there are some distinct differences there, and actually the involvement of the different processes and the amount of kit that there are to work out how you're essentially going to clean it and make it safe for use is just it's mind blowing, and it's only going to become more and more as we try to make people better, quicker with better technology, as you say, Hank. But it shouldn't get off the starting block until you can prove it can be cleaned.
We are speaking with Daniel Coole, Managing Director at Surgical Holdings in the United Kingdom. When we come back for the second segment, we'll get into his responsibilities as the chair of the Surgical Instruments Special Interest Section for the Association of British Healthcare Industries. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Okay, Daniel, so as we get into segment 2 here, I think one of the things Hank and I are really interested in hearing about, not only your role as the chair of the surgical instrument special interest section, but also what does that organization do, or what does that group focus on, and then give us an idea of what it's like to have to chair that section.
Okay, so the ABHI is the Association for British Healthcare Industries, and I believe there's over sort of 250 member companies of various shapes and sizes. So it's not just surgical instruments; it's everything, and a lot of the big players in the medical device world are involved. The ABHI back medical device developments, support of technology. Support of the UK medical device economy and promoting that throughout the world. If anybody's been to Medica before or Arab Health, they'll find the ABHI having a presence there and a very proactive and impressive presence. I feel myself. So the surgical instrument aspect of that, we're a surgical instrument manufacturer, a repairer. They have, sort of silo groups that are obviously focused on their area of interest. So I chair the surgical instrument section, or surgical instrument special interest section. So this is around about, I guess on average we have sort of 15 to 20 attendee companies, from large to small. It tends to be, obviously you have the sort of the B Brauns of this world attend, but it tends to be a lot of smaller companies as well. Because I think, with the industry association, it's an opportunity to get together and find out, what's everyone else doing and how's everybody else approaching the new regulations and, things like, who else is panicking about UDI coming in. And my role as chair is obviously to facilitate. I think I've been doing it for a couple of years now. And I see the group as a real great opportunity to get engagement with all stakeholders, because as a collaborative force that sort of can come together and obviously put our interests into the group. We've managed to engage with Institute of Decontamination Sciences, the IDSC. That's a key area there we're looking at of courses around the decontamination, safety, contamination, design of products. The Association of Perioperative Practice, which is essentially a theatre nurse association, or OR nurse association, as you guys would say. Recently, we've done an educational presentation for them at their annual congress around instrument identification. So, why is that needle holder got gold bows, and what does it mean? And additionally to that, trying to tie together what's happening in the industry. So we're trying to sort of link the two, and obviously. As an association, benefit from the engagement of these associations throughout the UK.
So, Daniel, talk a little bit about how that group, the ABHI, and just the industry in general, has responded to the updates to the Health Technical Memorandum 0101 that I believe came out July 2016 with the update. How's that impacted how that group is responding to the challenges in the industry, but then also on the user side, to what's going to change now in my local CSSD in the UK? Okay,
so just picking up the first point, obviously the new HTM, really the first benchmarker was July this year, so for high-risk instruments. The main thing that's changed, which you may be aware of through LinkedIn, is the introduction for some quantitative protein testing. So we have to hit 5 micrograms or under 5 micrograms for high-risk instrumentation. So that's obviously had a change. That is something that comes onto the agenda of the group, but also not just the group. It would also include the wider industry interest for the Association for British Healthcare Industries. So you have members who also steriliser companies, washer disinfector companies, people that make the protein swabs. So there's a wide interest there for the instruments group. It's something we've been discussing. Our most recent project was to release a brochure for education around surgical instruments and highlight some of the functions and features. So I think that's perhaps a first step into trying to help with the new regulations, the HTM, to help to start to re-educate and make people aware of terminology with instruments, different features, because if you've got to clean it, you've got to know where it is and what it looks like.
Exactly.
And I think there's a bit of an education piece there to do first. If we're going to clean stuff, we've got to know, and we're going to measure if it's clean. We've got to know where we're going to measure it. And I think the HTM. Did you want me to discuss a bit about the actual what it mandates as such?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add, I want to emphasize a point you just made about the anatomy of the instrument, essentially. No surgeon goes into doing a procedure not knowing what the body is going to look like when they get there. And I feel like that's the same thing as far as that education piece and how important it is. There are so many, I'd say, features, especially with new and more complex instrumentation coming out, that people don't necessarily learn about it, not just like needle holders. And still, I feel like there's education you can do with basic instrumentation, but understanding that anatomy of the instrument the same way that the surgeon is the expert on the anatomy of the human body is really a very, very key point here. And want to just commend you for doing the education that you're doing to help raise that awareness.
Yeah, well, it's something we feel is really important. I mean, as a company, personally, we've always focused around education and trying to get people to our factory and sort of show them what we do, and so they can sort of feel the passion that comes through from our staff for what they're doing and the care. And if that is something like a needle holder, yeah, all right, you might know that it's got tungsten carbide jaws, but do you know how they're put in there or why they're put in there, or what, if you're having something repaired, for argument's sake, what the steps you should take if you're doing that. So there's you feel sorry for the staff from Sterile Services point of view and theatres or OR, because it's such a minefield of information. And I think where we've tried to, in the UK, we've got a shortage of nurses at the moment. So there's a fast track, to get nurses into the OR, into theatres. And the feedback we're getting from both that and the sterile services side of things is that, some of this important educational stuff that was done probably, 20, 30 years ago, because we're told that it was and that people are aware of, what the different features are on instruments, that's sort of skipped. And the thing that concerns me a little bit is that if that's skipped, how do we know when we're making up our instrument sets how we make somebody better? What combination of instruments are we going to use, and why might you need a supercut, or why might you need a certain type of retractor if you don't know what they're for and what the features look like? So there's something there, and that's, as a group in the ABHI, that's something that the education is something we're really discussing. We're trying to work at how we can keep promoting and keep educating, and the appetite is there. It really is there to get that sort of widespread.
So Daniel, going back to what you mentioned about the protein testing recommendations coming out of the HTM 0101, I see that as coming for the U.S. So obviously you're there for the U.K., but even in reading the HTM update, there still seems to be a lot of ambiguity or understanding that the technology is not totally there. We're not totally clear what this is going to look like on the front line. What seems to be the vibe on the ground level there in the UK? Are departments prepared for this? Are they compliant? What does it look like?
Well, I'm quite fortunate. I attended this week. I think it was this week. I sort of lose track of time. So on Monday we had the CSC, which is the Central Sterilising Club. I hope I've said that right. They had their study day on Monday. So the emphasis around that was, okay, 1 year on protein, what are we doing? And actually, sort of in the industry, you get a vibe for, there is technologies that have been made available for testing protein, and some may agree with that, some may not agree with that. But interestingly, on the study day on Monday, there was a lady who had implemented the technology, which was a line of sight technology for measuring protein, and sort of gave a glowing report of how it's integrated into her department and how it's working well for her. Obviously, on the other hand, there were other presentations that were done at the study day that highlighted that there are new technologies now for things like swabbing that may have progressed from the ones that were perceived to have not worked as well when the studies was done. However, we worked with the research we had at the time when these devices and this regulation was being developed. So I think what overall the vibe for me is that protein solutions that are out there, it's about having a toolkit, and it's not a one size fits all approach. There are products there that that might lend themselves to a swab, and on the other side of things, the line of sight technology that's being utilised well in some hospitals may also be used. So I think it would be a matter of sort of burying your head in the sand if you just felt there was one approach, because Hank, seeing you comment about the complexity of some instruments, that you cannot just go with one thing and say, right, all right, we've done the test, it's clean, we're comfortable, there might be some protein in it, but let's not worry about that. We've passed the test. Let's get on with it. You can't think like that, because at the end of the day, there's a patient that this device could be used on, who could be your mother or father or family. So it's not about, for me, meeting the regulation. It's meeting the regulation for the safety of the patient.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the award that you won for the Whitlow retractor. Okay,
so that was a few years ago now, and it was through again, it was like an innovation competition through the AFPP, the Theatre Nurses Association. So it was really just a design that a surgeon had approached us, who had an idea for a bit of a quirk on a retractor system, or a standard retractor that was out there already. So this particular product was for vaginal hysterectomy, and the surgeon, Barry Whitlow, who, it was something that he desired, if you like, that a product that he felt that if he could get it realised, he could make a difference. And I think what we found is that, it was something that, and this is how quite often it happens with surgeons, you get approached with a sort of a rough sketch. And you've probably seen, Hank, you've probably been given things by surgeons like, I need to get me one of these. And you look at it and you think, okay. But it's taking that through the design and sort of, risk analysis. And quite often, a lot of new surgical devices are just slight modifications on previous designs or ones that are out there. But obviously, this was recognised as something that was forward-thinking for vaginal hysterectomy. And we got an award for the innovation in that area, and it's something that we're still working with Barry Whitlow on, and he uses for training and obviously in theatres at his hospital in Colchester in Essex.
So, Daniel, you wrote a blog a while ago asking the question, is innovation in surgical instrument manufacturing slowing down? And obviously, with your team winning these awards, there's a sign there that at least there are groups of folks who are not slowing down on that innovative view. But in the industry at large, is that innovation changing? Is it going the wrong direction? What's your perspective on that?
I think I wrote that article from the perspective of the new regulations that are coming out, and that although rightly so, obviously we need things to be clean, and we need to design them correctly so that can happen. And actually, the new regulations aren't just about cleaning, but you need to make sure that we don't stifle innovation and innovative thought through regulation. So there's got to be a bit of a balance. And I think what's happened is, whereas companies like ours, smaller companies, the surgeon might pick up the phone and say, look, I want to make this hook, or I want to do this. We're now worrying about, the overall accountability of it. And sometimes it's just not worth doing, because it's not worth the extra work. Whereas I mentioned at the start about surgical instrument makers being craftsmen. Well, there's nothing sort of more a craftsman like than just knocking up something new or something that helps the customer, but the reluctance is there now is becoming to help as much because of the regulatory burden. And it seems that obviously this is more suitable to the bigger companies who maybe have the big design and development departments, whereas companies like ours, you sort of you've got to think twice now, because you can't just like in the previous days have a crack at something and sort of say to the surgeon, look, go away and try this. It's really got to be fully accountable. We've got to obviously go through the design cycle, the risk analysis. So just see what I mean regarding it's just regulation stifling innovation. I think
it's cost. It's completely cost related. To get into that now costs so much to get a return on that investment, that instead of saying, I'm just going to help out and we're going to do this slight modification, which is a new design, becomes a whole different ball of wax financially for a company. I totally understand that. As we wrap this second segment, Daniel, can you just give us a quick overview? This is really interesting to me, the National Apprenticeship Scheme.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is something that I think the Conservative Party in the UK, without getting political, has pushed, and it really is to help the in the UK, the school leaver age. So it used to be 16, it's now gone to 18. So what you have to, as a kid of that age, you either stay on at school and do what we would call our A levels, which are our the next stage of qualification before you leave school, or you can go into an apprenticeship now. So this has been promoted, and obviously for the benefits of companies and young people, likewise. So for a company like ours, that's actually developed only through apprenticeships, because we have 5 people now that I think are at the age of around about mid-20s, who trained alongside the guys in the factory that passed on their skills to them and developed them and gave them a sort of profession in that way. So I think apprenticeships were traditionally in the UK associated with perhaps engineering and I suppose trade jobs, but it's being rolled out now sort of countrywide to everything and anything and everything. Young people can get involved in businesses, and we have 3 apprentices, one who works in our repairs administration, 2 in our office who deal with obviously day-to-day business, speak to hospitals, speak to our sales team. It puts them in straight into the mix in adult working life, and they either obviously learn fast and benefit from that and grow as people and start contributing to the economy, I guess, in that respect, or quickly you realise that they're not at that level. And I think a lot of it, when they come in, I think it's first about establishing a knowledge of work ethics and work behaviour. I can see, these apprenticeships, I gather from statistics, has had a decent take-up. Not enough, but it's certainly something that, as a business, it's completely changed our sort of dynamic of our workplace, having young people come in. And what's obviously amazing about young people is that they can all use technology. So all of a sudden, I think, if you think maybe 20 years ago, somebody coming into an office who's 16 or 17, who perhaps hasn't worked before, and certainly coming into medical devices, all of a sudden, because they're great on an iPhone and they know social media, they're valuable and they're contributing to the business. So that's something that the UK economy, I think, is benefiting from. I was only speaking to a friend last night whose son's been involved has got a sort of placement or sort of apprenticeship placement as a sports journalist, and he's out talking to soccer teams at the age of 19. And I'm diversifying away from medical devices, but the same applies. We've benefited on the ground in the factory from training the people up who want to apply themselves and learn a trade, and we're also now putting that into the running of the actual business as well.
Yeah, that makes such perfect sense. And it's always been interesting to me, having a background in the repair industry as well, that there really is no specific training for that. It is all apprenticeship. It's all mentorship. Very few manufacturers will train technicians to do the actual repairs on their instruments unless it's in-house. So the dissemination of those techniques and those skills is really passed on from people who may leave a manufacturer and go into the repair industry, or have done the repairs in the past and just learn from practices in other industries. But it's interesting to see that you're bringing in engineers and then helping them, as many people do. If you get just some sort of, like in the U.S., a bachelor's degree in business, that doesn't mean that when you go and work for a business that you understand that business. It means you have the skills and the abilities to apply your learning of that business and then how you tailor the approach. And I think it's the exact same way when you make the analogy to engineers. They have the skills to be able to do that, but then you have to teach them the nuances of the business itself. So very interesting stuff, Daniel. As we wrap up here, segment 2, looking forward to coming back in segment 3 and talking to you about some of that manufacturing, the instrument coatings, care, testing methods, some other challenges in repair. So we'll shift gears from manufacturing to repair a little bit. And you also talked about UDI law and how you had to adjust to that. I think there's some things that tie in with RFID technology that we're seeing in the UK as well. So we'll come back after a short break. We are back with Daniel Coole, Managing Director at Surgical Holdings in the United Kingdom. Daniel, we talked about a number of things in segment 2, but I do want to get into instrument coatings such as non-reflective coatings, maybe also dipping versus using instrument tape for identification. And that'll kind of lead into maybe the RFID technology and how you've worked to prepare for unique device identifier, the law and regulation that's coming across there. So maybe just give us an overview of some of the coatings, non-reflective. I know there's gold plating. A lot of times I'll do some education in departments and they think the instrument's actually made of gold, and they don't realize that if it was, it'll obviously be a much more expensive instrument. It's really just coated on the outside.
What, you mean they're not?
Yeah. It would be kind of nice if they were, wouldn't it? I mean,
yeah.
As far as recycling, you'd get a lot more motivation to get those recycled properly.
Yeah, certainly. Actually, we had someone a visitor down in the factory yesterday, had all their gold jewellery polished, just actually on the subject. So, you're right. You do see a lot of different coatings on devices, and I think again, education, because people don't know why they're there. Obviously, the common one that is used is gold, which is obviously just a gold plating, which is used for generally identification and a prompt to remind people that there's a tungsten carbide in a device, or there's a certain difference on a jaw. But I mean, we've been working with coatings which are more around a ceramic sort of carbon-based coatings for devices that really was born out of some interest around some projects that have been done in the UK research-wise. I think University of Southampton were looking at anti-fouling and anti-protein coatings that are, they looked at things like a DLC coating, which don't challenge me on the acronym because I can't actually remember what the thing's for. But it obviously said diamond-like carbon coating is what it was applied. The idea is that we're looking at the surgical instruments. People are worried about protein sticking on instruments, so they're trying these different coatings, and these universities have tried them and proven that if we apply these coatings and effectively smooth out the surface of the stainless steel, then, funnily enough, they wash a bit better and the protein doesn't stick. So it's a bit of a common sense thing, really.
I also think about laparoscopic instruments where that insulation, I know we don't necessarily want to term that as a coating, but it's a different material that's going over stainless steel. It's a heat shrink material, and of course, whenever you sterilize, in most cases, in an autoclave anyway, you're using heat for the sterilization process, and so that coating or that insulation is going to continue to thin or shrink with every reprocessing. And I wanted to kind of dive off that because I know you're noting different materials, different coatings, and how that might harbor a protein. And we know eventually if the insulation on a lap instrument gets thin enough, it won't necessarily hold its position on the stainless steel, and it can allow bioburden and protein to get up underneath that insulation. But I wanted to ask you a more overarching question about utilizing different materials. You see handles on surgical instruments that are made out of a polymer versus, nobody really uses wood so much anymore. It's more of a composite that's made to look like wood. But all of these different materials, when you go and then try to get the instrument or the device approved for cleaning and sterilization, the use of multiple different types of materials, does that present a challenge to cleaning?
Yeah, because obviously, you can't just crack on and start trying to use a material that's not obviously medically approved. So the first step would be, if we find something that we think can work better. So you mentioned the wooden handles. I mean, in the UK, we know it as Tufnell, which is effectively like a sort of wound resin rag that is traditionally used on mallets, osteotomes, chisels. When it gets smashed with a mallet, it tends to chip off and break down. And Hank, you would have seen this. You get nice little crevices for bugs and everything to hang about in. So we want to get rid of that stuff because although the surgeons might like it because sometimes it gives a nice cushion blow, it's no good for washing and sterilising. We know that. So we use different sort of medical grade plastic alternatives to test those. Generally, we would consult with a local hospital who would, do some trials with us, potentially with a sort of thermocouple, making sure everything reaches the right temperature for sterilisation. And then, the advantage of a Class 1 instrument is that a lot of this stuff has been out there already, so it's not really too much of a change in design, although it's a change in materials. Interestingly, we talk a lot with the Association for British Healthcare Industries about standards and instrument standards, and in the UK we have British standards for surgical instruments. However, they don't cover really a wide raft of testing criteria. So, there's a little disclaimer in the British standards which says, look, a lot of this is down to the interpretation of the manufacturers, so it's down for us to sort of take it on board. Look at the problem, which might be a Tufnell handle that we don't want to have to use that anymore, and then look at the potential solution. And quite often there's new modern solutions, and you sort of talk about plastics and wood, but we should really be moving away from that. The only thing, I think, you then present yourself with new challenges, because you in the States, interestingly, you're saying there's a lot of variety of different processes for sterilising and washing. Well, some of these plastics, these medical plastics, they're great through an autoclave, but if you try and gamma irradiate them, then you're going to have problems. So it's educating, putting the information in the instructions for use, making sure people are aware of the limitations, and validating. When you get a setback that's been used 100 times, have a look at it, see what it looks like. Some real sort of practical validations that, so you can prove and say, right, we know this is still safe. We know we're going to, but I think we should always be changing and looking to improve things where the patient's going to benefit from it.
So Daniel, you talk a little bit about how that instrument, I think we referenced the CE markings, from the manufacturer, but at the facility level in the department as users, it's very common for departments to want to mark their instruments in some way, either through color dipping, or oftentimes you'll see instrument tape that will signify particular sets or service lines.
Yeah.
What's the feel in the UK for those options for instrument marking, and are there issues with infection control there that are being considered?
Tape is some of the tape that we see is not nice. For you peel it off, and there could be all manner of stuff hiding. And although obviously you sterilises the surface, if a bit of the tape comes off under the surface, it's not sterile, so it can't really work. The tape. I think some people do still use it, and I think this is where, in the UK, the IDSC, Institute for Decontamination Sciences, has a lot of members, but not everybody is a member. Not everybody in the decontamination department is a member. So some of this sort of common sense stuff, like, don't put sticky tape around your instrument, because also what's the sticky stuff that's sticking the tape? Is it biocompatible? How do we know that? How do we know it's going to be compatible on the instrument as well? The hospital makes a big investment in cost, and also that's something we're seeing with the gels. We're being advised with the new HTM to keep instruments moist because it's easier to wash them. It makes sense in a way. We don't load up the dishwasher unless you're my wife who just chucks anything in it, filthy dirty, like after spaghetti bolognese or something. And so generally you'll wash stuff off a little bit before you put it in and clean it. So using gels is a good idea. But again, do we know enough about what they're doing to the instruments? And that's something, again, as a group in the ABHR, we're trying to reach out to the chemistry companies, find out what they're recommending. Can we work together? Can we make it a perfect experience for SSD when they get their devices back and it's been a few days before they reprocess, but they've been coated and been sprayed with something and they've gone rusty? We don't want any of that stuff happening. I think it's just collaboration and certainly not using things like, where you can, antiquated things such as instrument tape. There are colour curls I've seen as an alternative. You mentioned dipping. I'm not that familiar with dipping for colouring instruments. Is that something that's done in the States?
Yeah, it's a nylon dip. So it puts like a nylon coating typically around the ring handles and often used to distinguish service.
So like a diathermy, like electrosurgical coating, yeah? That sort of same sort of thing, like a diathermy or a monopolar coating, that sort of thing, is it?
Yeah, which there's still challenges there, obviously, with cracking in the same way and upkeep. And it sounds like that's just a global industry challenge that as yet we have not solved.
Well, I almost wonder if that's a good way to go into the UDI law, because if we talk about having some sort of marking for an instrument as a unique device, and I know that that's still model specific versus instrument level, but I know Hank also wanted to talk to you about RFID technology and marking instruments. I think this is just a natural leaping off point from here, because instrument level tracking would really allow us to take an instrument, say, with a bad coating that had been cracked, that had been, when we find that maybe it's missing a tungsten carbide insert, we could track that back to a patient and proactively do an x-ray before they leave the hospital to see if that insert was actually left behind during the case. And so there's some things that hospitals could do at a whole other level. So maybe just talk about how you're preparing for UDI law and regulation, and then we'll dive into the RFID technology and the practicality of that.
Yeah, sure. So with UDI is a bit unknown in the UK at the moment because we're all sort of guessing. We've not really had the complete direction yet as to where it's going to go or to what level. I think obviously we're watching what you're doing in the States with the Class 3 instruments, and it's gradually coming through. People are taking their own steps with things like implants and making sure we're barcoding on on implants, and that patients have labels and things like that. So we're taking those steps. But in the UK, we've managed to also added another complicated step in that the Department of Health have also now mandated that we're supposed to be doing something called e-procurement, which is slightly at odds to the timelines of UDI. So e-procurement is more around, I guess it's more around a sort of commercial rather than patient safety thing. So like to help benchmark pricing. So barcoding instruments, then logging that on databases, which is similar to UDI, but it's a sort of different model. So we're hoping at some stage this is all going to align and everyone's going to know what they're doing. And, we see that in sterilisation departments, they utilise GS1 marking for GIAI, for individual asset identification. And it works quite well when it's applied and when the solution is to track the individual instruments. However, what we're seeing now is that companies are putting their own barcodes on and starting to try and get ahead of the game and add their own UDI. But obviously when that goes into the sterile services, they don't know what barcode to scan and what barcode you have on it if you're a distributor rather than a manufacturer. So, is that similar to what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I think that the instrument level is typically done with a 2D barcode today, and to your point about some manufacturers trying to put that on ahead of time, I think the challenge is if the department is trying to mark the instrument at the instrument level, that 2D barcode may be model specific and not specific to the instrument. And I think the other issue that comes into play, as it is with any database, if that is not a globally managed number, then you can get into the tracking system and that number may represent an instrument that's already in that system. So yes, if the facility is trying to go instrument level and they're receiving instruments with a barcode and then having to place another barcode on their instrument, unfortunately nobody can remove the prior barcode because it was applied by the manufacturer. I mean, it may wear off over time, but it can't be removed. That does represent a challenge. I'm sure on basic instruments you can place the barcode in a consistent area, but as we know, once we started to get into micro instruments and other specialty instruments, putting a barcode on becomes a real challenge for the staff to know consistently where to find that barcode.
Yeah, it's very tough. And also some hospitals in the UK that, again, it's about the education. You sort of steam in and buy a laser mark instruments and then experience rusting issues because obviously, we all know with, the carbon, the iron content on instruments, you can't just burn into an instrument and then stick it in a washer disinfector and not expect there to be some sort of potential for rust or tarnishing on the instrument. So I sort of wonder with UDI aspects and looking at 2D matrix, if we're wasting a lot of resources in trying to get that right when, RFID technology is improving all the time. We've done a bit around that ourselves early on. The technology, it's developing, as I say, the reading technology is developing all the time. So, are we wasting time looking at the 2D alternative and scanning it when potentially we could be investing in looking at the future of UDI?
So when you talk about investing in the future, I think we'll wrap on this topic, but what about RFID technology to go to the instrument level. We've seen, I think, some emerging technologies where there's a dot with RFID. One of the real big picture things I've always thought would really help the sterile processing staff and physicians with preference items, et cetera, would be if the OR could separate what's been used versus what wasn't used in the case and then be able to scan them. You would really get some next level data. A lot of the interviews that Hank and I have done to date have talked extensively about how much opportunity there is for improvement in efficiency metrics regarding gathering additional data. But obviously, as you know, even if we were able to scan a barcode, scanning which instruments used and which ones were not used is really just not, it's prohibitive due to time. But separating them during the case and maybe scanning all of them all at once with two different codes, the RFID could give us a whole another level of advanced metrics. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we're all desperate to get there, aren't we? Because, we know what technology is like nowadays, and we know we should be utilising it. And I think with the advancements, with Apple and everything that's going on recently with their new phone, you can't quite believe we haven't really got an RFID chip right yet that we can stick on an instrument. So that, for me, as soon as we've got that sorted, that opens up everything for us. I mean, the UK NHS, we talk about how everyone wants to know, how do we quantify value for money? I can tell you that I sell a high quality instrument and it's going to last for X amount of years, but there's no way I can put that down on paper and make a buyer who isn't focused on price solely believe that. But I think if you can start getting data, as you say, and start recording how many times things are used, I can prove how many times my device has been used, and I can prove the value for money there. So that's going to be a real change. But I mean, interestingly, we've done some early RFID. We've done an early RFID project with a hospital. Again, there's a review of it on LinkedIn, and that the challenge around there was working with the clinicians, getting them to tell us where they want the RFID chip, and then looking at. I mean, we did it on some of our own instruments, so we haven't got to really worry about necessarily the liability of working with other people's instruments yet, but making sure we attach the chips so they don't come off, so utilising laser welding and correct use of adhesive, and having a specification and doing obviously all the correct validation and tests on the product, so make sure that obviously if the chip does come off, they're biocompatible. But interestingly, we did this on I think 50 instruments, and we turned up at the hospital. The hospital was keen to integrate it into their sterile services. I think it was set up in an hour, and we had somebody with just a basic RFID mat scanning the instruments across the mat. They were reading straight into the system in the dirty side of the sterile services department. We then went and set up the same thing in the clean side. Again, very very quickly set up. And immediately they're scanning, they're running across the RFID reading mat, and the data's just flowing, and the guy actually in the hospital said, "Look, this is why we want to do it," and he showed me his sort of board, if you like, of all the supplementary instruments that where are they? So these lists and lists of instruments. So clearly, if we can start implementing RFID, even if it's at a sort of supplementary level. And the surgeons, not all the surgeons are going to like it. We've had good feedback from the hospital that was involved in this, but there will be some, of course, who feel that it obviously may possibly impairs the use of the instruments, which I sort of feel that, sometimes you've got to think beyond and you've got to think patient safety, and they've just got to, maybe go with it. But then on the other hand, you get some surgeons who like the idea that they've got this cool chip on there that's recording how many times the instrument's being used. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just think sometimes the surgeons feel like, the dot as it's constituted today obstructs their use and feel of the instrument. And you're right, there's going to be some challenges, and maybe they're looking for another level of advancement in how the RFID technology can be placed within an instrument. Obviously, with the variation in design and manufacturing, that definitely also presents, some challenges to try to make that smaller, but there's no doubt that the data would be extremely useful. And I will say one other thing before we wrap, but UDI law, one of the things that's built into that is that it would also be a repository for the instructions on the instrument, and I'm assuming instructions for use. Being able to take that instrument and scan it without actually touching anything in decon, and we've talked about this on a prior interview as well, that you could bring up the instructions for use, especially on the more complex instrumentation, would be a huge benefit to patient safety in departments all around the world. So I want to tell you, I think we could do a whole another podcast, and we've said this before, Hank, and we'll say it again with Daniel today. I think we could do a whole nother podcast specifically on instrument level tracking and integration with UDI law and some of the implications of that. And I'm sure that we're going to look at that, and we'd love to have you on again in the future.
That'd be great, and I really appreciate the invite on. It's been a really interesting chat, and hopefully we can take that forward and see how we can begin to integrate the sort of forward thinking between the US and the UK.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. That was Daniel Coole, Managing Director at Surgical Holdings in the United Kingdom, and also the Chair of the Surgical Instrument Special Interest Section for the Association of British Healthcare Industries. All right, Hank. So another great guest in the books there, Daniel. Really a lot of experience with the UK, which is something I'm just learning about, the differences between, regulation abroad and stateside. And I think a little bit of insight into that. I thought it was neat, the whole theaters versus the operating rooms terminology, just out of my own curiosity. I enjoyed that discussion. But from the standpoint, especially for me, like the different coatings, the cleanability, and even investigating deeper into what the impact of some of these moistening agents that will assist with pre-cleaning, at point-of-use cleaning, and making sure that blood or other bioburden doesn't dry on the instruments before it hits decontam was also a pretty big point of emphasis from my standpoint.
Yeah, Justin, you're exactly right. And we've talked on previous shows about silos and the challenges they pose inside facilities. But one of the great things about having a guest on like Daniel, who has his own perspective there in the UK, obviously, but for all of our listeners, we get to see and hear the same challenges oftentimes, possibly different solutions, different regulations coming out, but all getting to that same ultimate goal for safe patient care. And super interesting topics that we covered. One of the big things that I took away is their push and their success even on creating a dynamic in their profession at the facility level as scientists, so they're able to recruit in those folks maybe with a microbiological background. And the more that happens, if it's protein testing or whatever the focus is, I think we cannot help but grow as an industry globally. So yeah, great interview. Had a fantastic time with him.
Yeah, I think the other thing that stood out to me was just instrument level tracking. We started to get into it. I think you and I both realized that this is going to have to be a focus for an entire podcast in the future. And maybe can line up 2 or 3 different perspectives, 3 different guests, maybe in 20-minute segments for an episode like that.
That's right. The apprenticeship scheme as well that he mentioned, and that idea of bringing folks in straight out of high school, or to what we would consider high school here in the States, teaching them that trade, just a fantastic model, I think. And as you said, we're already doing that on the instrument repair side of things, but great perspective there for pulling in fresh ideas, new blood into the industry so that we can have more 4th generation, not only surgical instrument makers, but sterile processing technicians. So yeah, just great topics all around.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing to us on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd love a rating and a review because we're just getting this thing off the ground. Would like to hear your thoughts on how we can improve or topics for future shows. So certainly engage with us there or on LinkedIn and the Facebook page. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.